welcome to SFC's Food for Thought series. Today we have Brooke Hartwick with us, and I will just give a quick intro for Brooke. After completing a Bachelor of Science in Ontario, Brooke moved out west to join ConocoPhillips environmental operations team, where she developed and implemented environmental protection programs in order to meet regulatory requirements and to ensure that ConocoPhillips minimizes their environmental impact at core assets throughout Canada. During this time, she graduated from the University of Calgary, completing an MBA specializing in sustainable energy development, which she now uses in her current role with the Sustainable Development Team. In this role, Brooke focuses on supporting the planning and implementation of low carbon technologies in order to reduce the absolute emissions and carbon intensity of assets within Alberta and BC. So we're very excited to have Brooke today. And I realized I forgot to introduce myself. So hi, I'm Kira. I'm part of SFC. I've been a contributing member for 2 years now, and I'll let Justice introduce himself, and then we'll get going on Brooke's presentation.
Hi, Brooke. I'm Justice. I've been with SFC for about 1.5 years now. I went to the University of Alberta for business, and I majored in finance, minored in economics. And yeah, that's what I'm currently pursuing right now. So I will let Kira take it away.
Awesome. Just a quick reminder to all our viewers that if you have any Q&As or if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. You can send them in whenever you have them, or you can put them in the chat too if you prefer. And with that, I'll let Brooke take it away with this fantastic presentation.
All right, that's a lot of credit there right at the start. We haven't even started here, so let me know at the end, fantastic or not. But thanks very much for the invite here to talk today. Always excited to get the chance to talk about what we're doing here at ConocoPhillips, as well as in the oil and gas industry in general, because there's not really a ton of people, even outside of Alberta, that realizes the amount of work being put into our sustainable development side of our operations. And so any chance I have to broadcast that is a great opportunity. So we'll just kick into the presentation here. And like Kara said, any questions, happy to answer them either during or after the presentation here as they come about. So really what I want to highlight here is the ever-changing landscape that we're dealing with in Canada and elsewhere as we think about our greenhouse gas and our carbon targets. It's really a story of never-ending ambition. It started back in 1990 there with United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and that started to really target a modest return to 1990 levels by 2000. But then between 1990 and 2019, emissions increased by just over 20%. This was driven primarily by increases in the oil and gas industry, as well as the transportation emissions. And then the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1997, although Canada only ratified this agreement in 2002. And that changed our target once again at 6% below 1990 levels by 2012. And then we did withdraw from that protocol, Canada did, in 2012. And so then we signed into the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, and that moved our baseline to the 2005 emissions level. And we had a new target of reducing our emissions by 17% below 2005 by 2020. So lots of changes there, and then even more so in the last few years here when Justin Trudeau signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, and that increased Canada's ambition to a target of 30% below 2005 levels by 2030. But you see there, our projected emissions are expected to be well short of the Paris target in the reference case. And then just in 2021, the Trudeau government announced a pledge for an even more ambitious target of 36% below 2005 levels by 2030. And just 3 days later, At the Biden Climate Summit, Trudeau increased this target to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. So as a sector, we're always trying to stay on top of what is happening around the world, what our commitments are federally, provincially, and how we can contribute to the reduction in emissions. I think that's just good business for us as a corporation, as well as for us within the provinces and as a country. And when we're looking at meeting these targets, which is about, by the way, a 300 million ton reduction that we need to meet, and that is pretty substantial. The oil and gas sector has made a growing commitment to help Canada meet these targets, and we're mindful on how they are set and how we mirror those internally in our companies as well. Most people have heard of greenwashing, and really we see that as setting targets without having any idea on how you're going to get there, and without any intention of changing the funding, the resourcing, or the processes to help us get there. But we also look at green wishing, which is setting targets without any idea on how we're going to get there, but having the intention to provide the funding and the processes to help meet the target. The third level, what we really try to focus on is the evidence-based target, which is building a roadmap to achieve the target and providing the funding, resources, and process in place to meet that target. As sustainable development professionals, we really look we need to ensure that we never descend into greenwashing, and we do everything we can to convert the green wishing phase into the evidence-based targets. Flipping over to the next slide, this looks at a little bit of our internal process on how we're trying to hit that drive to net zero and our internal targets as well. And there's 3 levels that we look at towards reducing our overall absolute emissions as well as our emissions intensity. The first one, avoid. That's pretty self-explanatory. If we produce fewer absolute emissions, we're better off as a company. We also look on how we can improve our core assets. So I spent a lot of time, I was based up at our SAGD facility in Fort McMurray. I rotated in and out of there for 2 years. And there's a continuous drive to find ways that we can increase the efficiency on the equipment there, whether that's new, better compressors or whatever else might be available. We're always trying to see how we can increase the efficiency. The next one, which is starting to get a lot more attention these days, are the low carbon technologies. And that's where I spend most of my time here these days. This is carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, electrification. There's a lot of talk on those big topics, but there's also a lot of smaller initiatives that go on internally at ConocoPhillips, as well as at several other companies, to see how they can best leverage their core assets in order to utilize some low carbon tech. And then there's also offsets, which is a great alternative for some of those emissions that you simply can't avoid. So we look at where we can purchase, source, and or produce at some of our assets throughout the entire company portfolio to see what we can do about offsetting some of those emissions. And we've got a governance structure that touches all 4 of these emission reducing operations. It starts right up at our board of directors, all the way down to our operations, boots on the ground type of activity. So it really is a whole company effort to meet these internal, provincial, and federal targets. Okay, and then I mentioned in the last slide there, carbon offsets. And I think most people are pretty familiar with what a offset is. But just something that's worth noting is that the only offsets that we'll use are ones that are certified by a third party, saying that they are responsibly sourced and that they are either part of a reduction strategy or a removal strategy. So we hear a lot that we just go out and we buy whatever we can to offset our emissions. That's not actually the case. It's pretty well regulated and managed, and it goes through a large verification process on the buyer side as well as the seller side. And then looking at what emissions we actually are starting to measure and really focus on reducing, Historically, it has been our scope 1, which are direct emissions, and our scope 2 emissions. And so our scope 1 is really our flaring, the combustion, the process, and fugitive venting, and that makes up the vast majority of our emission base. We also look at our scope 2, which for us here in Canada is any emissions related to our imported electricity because we don't actually generate it on site ourselves. But scope 3 is where it's been getting a lot of attention recently. You may have seen a couple of articles in the last few months coming out talking about how the oil and gas sector have been underreporting emissions. And that's a pretty misleading headline because scope 3 has never been a regulatory requirement for us to measure and report on annually. Because once the product is out of our operational control and it's going to the users like yourselves, driving your cars, taking trips, purchasing products made with our main product here, it's a little outside of our control. But this has gotten an increased focus in the last couple of years, specifically since 2021. And so we're looking now as a company on how best we would not only measure this, but also manage, reduce to make sure that we are operating in as responsible a manner as possible. And then looking over at our actual net zero ambition. So this is, if you're interested in some, I think interesting, but that's up for debate reading. These come right out of the ConocoPhillips 2021 Sustainable Development Report, which is available just on our website there. It talks about our energy transition and what we're actually doing there internally to make sure we're partnering with our provincial and our federal governments and supporting them in the best way that we can. So it looks at, on the left here, some of the items that we're doing that we have already mentioned, such as, really finding those efficiencies, using some offsets, reducing our methane and flaring reductions, which actually a nice point on that is we do have an internal target to have zero routine flaring, which we've already achieved here in Canada. And now we're supporting some of our other business units on how they can do this as well and really make sure we're minimizing to the greatest degree possible the amount of emissions we're putting out there via flaring. Also, some of our transition activities are those low carbon technologies that we've dedicated quite a few resources, full-time employees, and capital towards meeting. And it's going to be, and actually I should mention over there as well, a big part of it is advocacy as well. We haven't talked about that here today, but we do advocacy with our shareholders, with our stakeholders, with the government, with various regulatory bodies, again, to make sure that we are moving as a sector and as a company in the same direction that we need to in order to make sure that we are acting in a manner that lets us continue our sustainable growth within Canada here. And then on the first slide, I showed you some of our federal regulations and target setting. On this slide, we've got some of our internal targets. So our near-term targets is we're really focused on a methane intensity reduction of 10%. And this is across the entire ConocoPhillips portfolio, not just the Canadian business unit. And then also that zero routine flaring, which we committed to 2 years ago, I think. And now we're really focused on helping other BUs achieve that flaring reduction. And then we go over to our medium-term targets, which is a 40 to 50% reduction in our greenhouse gas intensity by 2030. And a lot of the technologies that we've mentioned are going to be a key cornerstone in achieving this target. And then this goes all the way down to our 2050 net zero commitments to our shareholders. So it's a little bit about the pathway of what Conoco sees. And there's so many great partnerships within the sector, with our government, with our shareholders and our stakeholders that are going to help us achieve that target. So I think that's everything I had here on the slide deck. I'm not sure if there's any questions.
We do have a few questions in the Q&A. First of all, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really, really insightful.